Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Palestine Chronicle TV. This is your host, Ramzi Baroud. With me in the studio is my co host, Romana Rubio and Zarifa Baroud. But we also have a very special guest for you today, Professor Richard Falk. Now, many of you already know who Professor Richard Falk is, and we are anticipating quite an exciting conversation with him. But first, we are going to start by learning just a little bit or reminding ourselves just a little bit about Professor Falk, his books, and his accomplishments. Zarifa?
Professor Richard Falk is an Albert G. Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University and a Research Fellow at the Orphalia Center of Global Studies. He is also a visiting Distinguished Professor in Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Dr. Falk is the former UN Rapporteur on Palestinian human rights from 2008 to 2014. He is the author and co-author of numerous books, the most recent of which is entitled Palestine's Horizon Towards a Just Peace in 2017, and co-authored the book Toward a Just World Order in 2019. Dr. Falk also contributed the afterword of Dr. Ramzi Baroud's most recent book, These Chains Will Be Broken, Palestinian Stories of Struggle and Defiance in Israeli Prisons. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Falk.
Thank you. Happy to be with you all.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask, if you don't mind, Professor Falk, we know so much about you as an international law expert, as a very well-known academic, and also as someone who is directly involved in helping us understand the depth and the scope of the human rights violations that are taking place in Palestine today. But do you mind telling us a little bit more about yourself, your own background, and how did Palestine become a calling or become a very important juncture in your life and in your career?
Well, it started while I was still a student, and I had a close friend at Harvard Law School named George Abisab, who you may have heard of. He's the leading non-Western international law specialist, and we were students together. And he's an Egyptian non-Coptic Christian, but he was very committed to the Palestinian struggle. And he awakened me, probably later than should have been the case, to the Palestinian narrative. I'd been, as a kid and growing up in Manhattan, only exposed to the Israeli narrative. And even though I grew up in a family that wasn't particularly oriented toward Zionism or Israel, it still was quite an awakening for me to understand that this glorification of Israel had a dark side. And that was the beginning of my engagement. And then I became quite involved in opposing the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And in the course of that experience, I started to become what sometimes a fair amount of visibility, and I developed a friendship with Edward Said. And he used to tease me about being involved in all these other issues. What about Palestine? Mm-hmm. And I had been politically sensitive enough to know that Palestine was the third rail of American politics, and that you paid a price by engaging with that issue in the way that law and morality and a sense of justice would require an engagement. So I had put it off. I mean, privately, I was quite convinced by the Palestinian struggle, but in terms of my more activist engagements, I had avoided it. But Edward teased me into activism, and the story has evolved ever since then. That was probably in the late 1980s. And he had an attack. I was teaching at Princeton at the time, and he had graduated from Princeton, and he used to come once a year and teach my seminar, which of course humiliated me for the rest of the semester, but I managed to survive most of the time. And it was definitely our friendship. And then with Ibrahim Abu-Lugo, who was a close friend of Edward's and became my friend, and Iqbal Ahmed was another person that had acted in a way as Edward's political mentor and was a longtime close friend of mine. So we formed a kind of good little intellectual brain trust on Palestinian issues.
This is incredible, and I think many of our readers are going to find it. It's kind of like things are falling in place. Things make sense, because we think of you alongside Edward Said, Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, and Iqbal Ahmed as that generation that kind of really pushed forcefully and conditionally, without any sort of compromise regarding the rights of the Palestinian people. And here it is. It really does fall in place. But you said something in your comments, Professor Falk, about the price that is usually paid for those who stand up for Palestinian rights. Were you aware regarding the nature of that price, to what extent that price would be? And if I may be bold enough to ask, was there really a price to be paid for you personally?
Well, I always feel a little bit guilty about even mentioning it, because the price that I paid is so trivial compared to that of others. But it closed a lot of doors that had been opened previously, and put me in both in social contexts and in professional contexts in a kind of what shall I say, DMZ, or no-go zone. And this intensified greatly when I became special rapporteur in 2008, because then there was a lot of dissatisfaction with my selection, because Israel had campaigned very hard after John Dugard, who was my predecessor. His term came to an end, and he became gradually more anti-Israeli as his period of exposure to the realities of the occupation.
Okay. I think we are experiencing slight technical difficulties. No, we are fine. Go on, Professor.
And at that point, I began to be attacked as a self-hating Jew, and as somebody that was, in practical terms, a rabid anti-Semite. The Weizmann Institute put out a list of the 10 most dangerous anti-Semites in the world, that I was honored to be third in that list.
Third, okay.
The first was the Supreme Guide of Iran, and the second was the President of Turkey, actually.
Oh, wow.
And so it made me feel I was doing a good job. But if I elicited such defamatory exaggerations, it meant that this role of being an objective critic of Israel had a certain significance, which I think it did have, in terms of changing the discourse to some degree, at least within the UN framework. It didn't affect, sadly, what was going on behaviorally on the ground. That depended on other forces that I had no control or influence over. Just one final word on the cost. To me, it really involved being distracted at lectures and other things by Zionist efforts to have my talks canceled or academic appointments revoked. Overwhelmingly, that didn't happen. Although after our apartheid report, which was after my special rapporteurship, was released in 2017, and I was in London for the book launch of my book on Palestine.
That's right.
The firestorm that was created at the UN over this apartheid report led to, which succeeded in having two of my lectures canceled in London and a big conference at Southampton canceled. So there had been some, but as I say, I wouldn't make too much of it. I didn't suffer the way people like Norman Finkelstein and others, Stephen Saleda, and many others have had real struggles brought to them that they'd never deserved to have.
You know, it's interesting, Professor Falk, the Israeli response to any sort of criticism at the United Nations. Now, let me link this to a question. You know, once we promoted our talk today, many of our readers immediately responded with this kind of knee-jerk reaction, if you will, saying, well, you know, international law is useless because the United States will always make it impossible for Israel to be held accountable, and so forth and so on. If that is the case, if there is always an American veto standing in the face of the international community to pressure Israel to respect international law, why is Israel so scared? Why do they go after people like you and Dugard and others for daring to present any form of criticism to Israel within the international institution?
That's a really important question, Ramsey, that I've thought a lot about. And I think the beginning of an answer is that it's important to distinguish symbolic politics from substantive politics. And both of them have a great deal to do with political change and the resolution of conflict. In challenging those efforts to undermine their moral and legal legitimacy. At the same time, they're very adept at using law as an instrument of oppression. It's very, their attitudes, and this is true of any autocratic political arrangement, law is used for oppression, and it's ignored when it interferes with the will of the ruler or the will of the state. And in the colonial wars that were fought after 1945, the side that won usually was the side that won what I call the legitimacy war, which is the symbolic battlefield, so to speak, and maintain the principled position that was in accord with the anti-colonial flow of history. And these colonial wars were consistently won by the weaker side militarily. And the US has never learned that lesson, which it should have learned in the Vietnam War, where it had total military superiority and yet lost the war. It can't learn the lesson because its state is itself so militarized that it has to give priority to keeping the military budget high, and it can't do that without according credibility to the military instrument of control and change in the world. So these are complicated issues, But what is important to realize is that even though you don't change behavior by winning the legitimacy war or by succeeding with symbolic politics, you do change the atmosphere, the public atmosphere, and the sense of how the forces that are in contention, how legitimate they are. And this has affected, it didn't happen during the colonial era. There was no impact from this, these kinds of issues. But as colonialism and oppression lost their acceptance as forms of legitimate political behavior, the political balance shifted, and the perseverance of nationalist struggles turned out to be more formidable than the weaponry at the disposal of the colonial powers. And in some sense, that's the Palestinians have been up against an extreme form of this imbalance, because not only is Israel have this military capability and dominance, but it has unprecedented geopolitical backing from the strongest country in the world. And that has meant that even though the Palestinians are winning the legitimacy war, they still are not able to challenge the behavioral structures. And the UN is an instrument of geopolitics as much as it is a venue where law and morality are discussed and in some ways resolved. And people forget that it's both a venue of symbolic politics, but it's also a venue of substantive politics that geopolitics dominates.
But you spent 6 years at the United Nations, Professor Falk, kind of fully aware, of course, of this imbalance, and fully aware of the fact that you are contributing to the Palestinian side of this legitimacy war. Yet you are faced by numerous obstacles. Every American ambassador to the UN, of course, makes it the main mission of his or her to ensure that Israel is winning, at least at least prevailing against any attempt at delegitimizing it at the United Nations. What type of obstacles do you feel like you faced during these 6 years? What were the greatest of these obstacles, and did they succeed in pushing back?
Well, I think they succeeded in making my life miserable in various ways. And they have these very militant, Zionist-oriented NGOs like UN Watch that engage in defamatory kinds of activities and used all their resources and energies to persuade people, including the UN Secretary General, to criticize me and to urge my dismissal or resignation or some kind of censure. But in the end, those efforts were stymied, and the role of special rapporteur was respected, and you didn't hear so much about it. But there was a lot of support for my activities, including from foreign ministries in important third world countries, including outside the Islamic world. And so I felt that it was a important kind of presence to maintain. And I did feel that the discourse was influenced. It became okay to talk about colonialism instead of occupation, talk about incremental annexation, to talk about the fact that Israel was attempted to reverse the flow of history by imposing a Jewish state on a non-Jewish society. All those things became acceptable ways of expressing criticism. And of course, that's what made the Zionist groups angry and frustrated. And they didn't try to respond substantively to my reports on the violations of human rights in the occupied territory. Rather, they concentrated on defaming or smearing the messenger rather than addressing the message. And that is, I think, an expression of their realization that their substantive case was so weak that they were better off diverting the conversation away from the realities and talking about how those realities were being presented by a biased observer.
You know, you mentioned, Professor Falk, earlier that the term colonialism was finally, being introduced to the discourse of Palestine and Israel at the United Nations. This is really more of a technical question, and I've been kind of wrangling with it myself. The term, military occupation is a legal term that is meant to govern the relationship between the occupying power and the occupied entity, but it's also supposed to be a process that is not a process, an endless process, if you will. It's supposed to be a transition from something to something else. But the Israeli occupation has been carrying on for such a long time. Now, my question is it still an occupation in the legal sense? When will it cease to be an occupation and it becomes something else? Because certainly Israel is not behaving as an occupying power per the diktats and per the rules of international law.
Yes, absolutely. The question is more complicated than it should be because international law is rather ambiguous about the duration of a military occupation. And Israel has made a kind of specious argument that the Geneva Conventions and the normal law governing belligerent occupation doesn't apply here because this is disputed sovereignty rather than a case where another country has been occupied. So there is a legal ambiguity that makes even occupation a contested term. In addition to that, the law doesn't provide an endpoint to the occupation. And so the way, I think, the most effective way of challenging it from an international law point of view is that Israel has committed so many fundamental breaches of the obligations of an occupying power, the establishment of the settlements, the incremental annexation, the integration of Jerusalem into the sovereign state of Israel, are all fundamental violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and they represent an effort to make the end of occupation not possible in the sense that it was meant, turning the society back to the civilian population that is occupied. So it's a really serious flaw legally and politically one should go back to the Security Resolution 242 after the 1967 war, which was a unanimous resolution supported even by the US then, that affirmed that no territory could be acquired by military force, and therefore Israel was obliged to withdraw from the territory that it was occupied. Israel has relied on a very legalistic reading of that resolution to say that it presupposed prior negotiations over the exact delimitation of the border. But the clear intention was to mandate the withdrawal of Israel to the 1967 boundaries. And Israel never intended to do so. I mean,
thank you for that, Professor Falk. Let me bring in my co-host, Romana Rubio. Her and I have been doing a lot of research lately about what's happening at the International Criminal Court. We would like to kind of hear from you, your opinion about this issue, but let me give it to Romana to articulate the question better.
Yes, first of all, of course, it is an honor to speak with you, Professor Falk. I would like to ask you, in a recent interview that we conducted with Dr. Triestino Mariniello, who is an Italian lawyer who is representing the Gaza victims before the International Criminal Court. And he explained to us that currently the scope of the ICC investigation is narrow, meaning that the court is focusing on war crimes, but excluding, for example, crimes against humanity, the crime of genocide, and so on. So, first of all, I would like to ask you, why do you think that is the case? And also, if in the future, this narrow scope can be broadened at some point?
Well, the scope of investigation is something that is ill-defined, and therefore one has to assume that it's a matter of political discretion. The court takes a position that it needs to be cautious about delimiting its jurisdiction, and therefore it tries to narrow the scope of what it is prepared to investigate. I don't agree with this way of pursuing international criminal justice, but it does represent the fact that the International Criminal Court, like the UN itself, is subject to immense geopolitical pressure. And even though it is supposedly investigating the crimes of all political actors in the world, effectively, it's been virtually restricted to investigating the crimes committed in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's a breakthrough even to consider the investigation, let alone the indictment and the prosecution of either Israelis or Americans that has been put on the agenda of the ICC recently and led to this pushback from these governments, including the ridiculous initiative of the US, which is sanctioning the prosecutor because they dare to investigate allegations of US war crimes in Afghanistan, which are documented in many ways, including by the disclosures of Chelsea Manning, who went to prison because of that. But there's lots of evidence, also from WikiLeaks and elsewhere. We have many documents. And the same with Israel has denounced the court, and as if it is improper to examine any state that claims the mantle of geopolitical impunity. And so you have a core denial of the rule of law, which is fundamentally premised on the idea of treating equals equally. But in
I think there's a bit of
not subject to the same level of accountability that would accompany similar behavior on the part of Gabon or Mozambique, let's say.
Thank you, Professor.
this leads me to think, you know, a lot of people, including myself, are optimistic that this time is different. This is, you know, after every Israeli war, there is an investigation of, you know, alleged war crimes. Oftentimes, the investigation is blocked by, you know, international observers not allowed to be on the ground. But more or less, we end up with a strong condemnation of what Israel is doing and an urging to the international community to investigate this further. But it kind of quite often, if not always, doesn't really yield anything practical. This time we are told it's different. This is the first time the ICC is going to get involved in this capacity. And we could, in fact, at one point in the future, be seeing Israeli war criminals, you know, seeing their day in court. But are we being a little bit too optimistic here? What do you think?
Well, I certainly hope that you're not being too optimistic, that it is a real prospect, but it's a fragile prospect. And money plays a role, how the funding of these international institutions that go against geopolitical vital positions, they have been very timid in the past, as you suggest. Now they've been embarrassed into a little bit more assertiveness. But whether it's enough to carry them across the finish line of really pursuing these issues, which are in a way self-evident as suitable for criminal prosecution, and from the evidence that exists, almost certain conviction. And whether that can be implemented is another complicated political story, and probably couldn't happen in our lifetimes. But it's the way in which law evolves, especially internationally, is by struggle from below. It's not going to, the elites of the world are not going to make these changes, because the elites of the world are part of this broader atmosphere that is dominated in these areas, human rights and criminal law and use of force. It's dominated by geopolitics, which is a shorthand for saying what the larger, more aggressive states want to happen, what their policies and interests are.
But the rift has always been there. One of our readers from Canada just commented saying that 75 to 80% of all Canadians support the ICC investigation, but no Canadian political party does. We know that this is also the case in other countries. And I am sure in Europe itself, there is a, you know, as poll after poll has suggested that there is a very strong support for the Palestinians, but that doesn't translate into neither political parties nor governments. So this rift has been going on for a long time between civil society, between ordinary people and governments. I know that this is really more of a political or you know, non-legal question per se, but how do you suggest that we overcome this rift? How can the people on the ground, grassroots, workers, activist societies overcome this rift and become effective in terms of shaping the political views of their parties and their governments eventually?
Well, the very short answer to that is going to get that change through the established parties and the elites that dominate those parties. You see it very clearly in the US context, where the elites are both, on both Republican and Democratic side, are subservient to so-called bipartisan consensus. And that's existed ever since World War II. It persisted in the war against fascism, but then it also was persisted in the Cold War, and subsequent to the Cold War, it still, even in the age of Trump, has persisted. And that's true of many countries. It's an imperfection of democracy. That democracy is not governed by the will of the people, despite its rhetoric. It's governed by the will of the elites. And, you know, going back to the origins of the US, it was always seen as a republic rather than a democracy, and a republic that was dedicated to upholding the rights of property holders, not of, and was fearful of the mob, what was called the mob. And ever since ancient Athenian democracy, there's been this sense that the people are not to be trusted, and that there's a mythology that accords the people a sense of destiny in relation to a society, but the actualities of power, and you see it very much in modern contemporary terms, is subject to the control of economic and political elites. And especially in the sectors where there's strong lobbying forces. And Palestinians have over the years been very victimized by these anti-democratic elements that operate within the framework of a formal democracy. So you have procedural democracy, you have elections, but you don't have substantive democracy in terms of translating what people want into political results. And the Electoral College, just one final thought, the Electoral College in the US is a perfect example of the design of a constitutional democracy so that the voice of the people will be filtered through a second way of evaluating how to assess the will of the country. And it's obviously has brought to power Donald Trump, even though he lost the popular vote.
You can hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you now.
Okay. I'm going to push my luck with this question a little bit more. In the case of Palestine in particular, we have seen that at one point, of course, that rift also existed between the people and governments. In the case of apartheid South Africa, eventually the people managed to overcome it, and they managed to push their own views that apartheid was a crime and it was a terrible thing and needed to end, and it eventually ended. We are seeing many Palestinians right now kind of not necessarily duplicating, but using the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa as a guidance to their own struggle against Israel through the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements, and other tactics and strategies. Do you think the situation here is also applicable? Do you see the similarities between the situation in South Africa back then and the situation of Palestine now? And do you think that this strategy could also work once more?
Well, it's hard to look at the into that crystal ball and see clear images, but there is certainly a similarity. But there are also important dissimilarities. The geopolitical commitment to Israel is much stronger than what existed in relation to South Africa. Furthermore, in relation to South Africa, you had a very clear solidarity with people of color all over the world, and you had the UN backing that campaign, and the countries that had strategic interests with maintaining the status quo, like the UK and the US, were half embarrassed. They didn't have a real moral conviction behind their views, and so they eventually gave way to popular moral pressure. Having said that, I think there is a similarity in the sense that, as I indicated earlier, these struggles have been eventually won by the side that captures the high moral and legal ground. And I think the Palestinians are doing that, and the anti-apartheid and the BDS way of proceeding has really altered the public opinion on the West, and has led, of course, to the pushback, at the same time trying to criminalize support for these measures, defaming those that are activists, and really doing things that were never done in the anti-apartheid South African context, where, for instance, at my university at Princeton, there was a lot of opposition from the Board of Trustees and the president of the university, but no one even vaguely suggested that it was improper to advocate nonviolent BDS tactics. And the militancy of the Zionist pushback that has engaged several supposedly liberal governments in trying to BDS activism is a sign of what I said, that there is a much stronger geopolitical backing for the Israeli Zionist status quo.
Thank you very much. I know that I have dominated this conversation, and I apologize to my co-hosts, Rumana and Zarifa. But Professor Richard Falk and I were really meant to meet in the past, and yet our paths haven't crossed. So I was so eager to ask so many questions. So I'm now opening it up for more questions. If you guys have anything you would like to add, or anything you would like to ask of Professor Falk.
Yes, Professor Falk, when you talked about the geopolitical balance and the solidarity that the South African movement was receiving, I was thinking, of course, of the recent normalization deals and accords of two Arab countries at the moment. How, in your opinion, this changes the geopolitical balance, in favor of Palestinians or in favor of Israel?
Well, I think in the short run, it's a victory for Israel and for Trump, in the sense of being something that was helpful in Israel's effort to avoid isolation without a prior establishment of a Palestinian state. In other words, they broke the earlier Arab commitment to condition normalization on and Jerusalem as its capital. And this is, again, in the realm of symbolic politics, an important development, short term. It also signals to the world that the basic alignment in the region is no longer Arab versus Palestinian, but Arab and Israeli and US versus Iran. So it's a formalization of something that people knew previously, but it was given this kind of dramatic backdrop at the White House pre-election, and undoubtedly the UAE and Bahrain were persuaded that this was a good way to earn points in Washington, help Trump at a time when he needed help just prior to the election, the presidential elections in the US. And whether it has a longer term effect depends on what the Palestinians do themselves, what the participating Arab governments, does Saudi Arabia follow along? There are a lot of uncertainties. Turkey is also a factor in this situation because Turkey is another country that has sustained its support for the Palestinian struggle, and of course has generated the hostility of the US and Israel, and its own it has a lot of enemies around the world associated with the division of power here in Turkey itself. But the balance in the middle term will be determined by these factors and whether the global solidarity movement can grow and exert meaningful pressure. And my hope is that it will, and that this is a short-term outcome, not something that is really altering the regional balance. And of course, how Iran responds is also important because it is, in one level, it's an intensification of the threat, and whether it tries to do things that will escalate the tensions and conflict, or will wait and see how the American elections come out before and taking any action is hard to say.
Absolutely. I still want to ask you about Gaza, Professor Falk, but first I'd like to see if Zarifa, who has been doing a lot of research about the American, how Israel is using American weapons against Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, in violations of the US own rules and own laws regarding the use of weapons against civilians. Zarifa, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so I was just reading an article recently about Kamala Harris's response to critics asking her about her positions on Israel and if she would consider encouraging Joe Biden, if he became the president, to condition aid based on Israel's human rights violations as per US and international standards. How do you see the American election, either way that it goes, redefining or like changing this discussion at all?
Well, I'm disappointed, of course, by the Harris-Biden positions on Israel. I would have hoped for something closer to what Bernie Sanders was saying as a way of shifting the policies closer to the what I think a majority of American people would support and want. Again, it illustrates this disparity between the will of the people and the will of the governing elites. And so I don't think we can be very hopeful. Possibly on the annexation issue, Biden will be a bit more resistant to implementing de jure legalizing what is already a de facto annexation. But I'm not very optimistic that there will be any changes. It will be up to civil society activism, I think. One thing that one can say is that the politics of the recent past has made it almost impossible to envision a two-state solution. And that should create a foundation for Palestinian unity, which would be something that would help a great deal in, I think, giving confidence to people outside of Palestine that there is a consensus as to how a sustainable peace can be achieved. And the Palestinians have failed really to put forward their own vision of what kind of peace would be acceptable to them and should be acceptable to the international community as a whole. They've been put in the position over the decades of rejecting Israeli and US-backed proposals, but they need to be more, I think, for the fight for the public opinion, they need to be more proactive in developing their own visions of how to achieve a sustainable and just peace.
I'm glad that you mentioned the two-state solution, rather, Professor Falk, and I know that there are several initiatives, the latest of which is happening in Palestine, Israel, under the one-state campaign, where they are trying to push for this, or at least kind of plant the seed for these kind of new visions that hopefully will be adopted and embraced by the majority of Palestinians and eventually by the Palestinian leadership. But back to international law now, since we have this massive body of international resolutions that have been pushing for a Palestinian state within the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Just to put it kind of really simply, is the one-state solution consistent with international law?
I think it is. I mean, the issue really is, how do you define the right of self-determination in the context of Israel-Palestine? And there's no clear legal answer to that. I think the best answer is what the parties can agree upon, or the de facto answer is what they can force the weaker party to accept. In other words, it's not an issue that, for instance, the International Court of Justice could do more than say, this is something that international law does not give clear guidance about. Because it's you have overlapping sovereignty claims, and you have inconsistent experiences of occupation and various forms of agreement and policy positions, and no authoritative consensus has emerged. There was a kind of intergovernmental preference states expressed for a two-state solution. And there was an assumption that the geopolitical forces led by the US were favorable to a two-state solution until Trump came along. At least there was this formal support for that. But I think for a long time it was evident to close observers that Israel, for one thing, had no intention of really implementing a reasonable version of a two-state solution, and that it would not really satisfy the Palestinians sufficiently to be a sustainable peace. You might force an agreement down Ramallah's throat, but it wouldn't last. And so it would be a ceasefire again, not a peace.
Thank you for that. Professor Falk, our last question, and I know we have taken so much of your time. We really appreciate you taking the time and explaining these things that really otherwise would have went unexplained. Very, very informative indeed. Our last question is pertaining to the prisoners, and Romana is going to try to present that.
Yes, before we were talking about the narrow scope, and one of the issues that is excluded at the moment from the ICC investigation is the plague of the Palestinian prisoners. You wrote the foreword for Ramsey's book, These Chains Will Be Broken, a brilliant foreword about the Palestinian prisoners, and recently a very beautiful and enlightening article about the triple jeopardy: refugees, migrant, and Palestinian prisoners. So I would like to ask you if you want to, explain to us what this triple jeopardy is.
Yes. First, let me recommend strongly Ramsey's book, which really gives an insight into the torment of the prisoners and of their struggle for dignity, and how important they are as symbols of the most prolonged resistance to an unjust political situation in modern times. And as Nelson Mandela and others have pointed out, the Palestinian struggle is the great moral issue, unresolved moral and legal issue of the world in the post-apartheid atmosphere he was talking about, which was after South Africa was emancipated from racism. The failure of the international community to address the treatment of prisoners is part of this state-centric nature of world order, where the territorial authorities are given really basically unchallenged control over prisons and prisoners. And there's very seldom, except at the end of a war where you have a defeated country that can be charged with various forms of abuse, including abuse of prisoners. But short of that, it's very difficult to do more than hope that a country will impose its own standards of decency in the treatment of prisoners. And as we all know, where the conflict is so defined in terms of moral right and wrong, and where the enemy is demonized as terrorists and the adversary is viewed as a legitimate normal state. And so this heroic form of resistance that has affected people that are not at all engaged in violent struggle. It's involved poets and those that have expressed their resistance in nonviolent ways that should be honored rather than punished. And so it's very important that the kind of witnessing that Ramsey's book gives us the opportunity to have direct contact with, that as many people as possible are exposed to that. And I congratulate him for producing such a book.
I think this is it for us, right, guys? Yes, we'd like to thank you very, very much. Professor Falk, not just only thank you for taking the time to talk to us and for your support to me and to many other Palestinian writers, journalists, and intellectuals, but also for all the work that you have done for Palestine throughout the years. And I really I want to be pretentious enough to say, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the Palestinian people for everything that you have done for our cause and for everything that you will continue to do for our cause. And hopefully we'll get to meet you in person and hopefully sometimes.
Good.
Thank you.
No, I hope so. And you humble me by your words. And I really wish that the Palestinian people will have freedom while I'm still alive. And it's really one of the things that I hope to see happen in my lifetime.
Inshallah.
All of you for your commitment and dedication.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.